Hello everyone, it's Gabriella from Per La Victoire and welcome to another episode of Sitting on My Living Room Floor While I Sew Clothes That I Don't Need. I'm currently working on a Victorian corset, but as that's more of a complex, time-consuming project, I wanted to have smaller palette cleansing projects in between. So as I was looking through my stash of patterns, I found this one. Simplicity 1426, which is a pattern for 5 different styles of 1950s reproduction bra tops. Summer tops, bikini tops, not entirely clear in what context they're supposed to be worn, but as it's still summer where I live, I figure this is the perfect time to make a cute little summer top that I can wear with a high-waisted skirt or some high-waisted shorts, and that way I can get some sun on my vitamin D deprived body. Now, even better for this project, as I went through my stash of cotton fabrics, I found this quite small scrap. It might be equivalent to about a fat quarter. It's just an oddly shaped little scrap that pieces have been cut out of. I'm assuming it's cotton. It could have some polyester in it, frankly, I'm not sure. What I do know is that this scrap of fabric was actually given to me by my grandmother. So I know it dates to between the 1960s and 1980s, because that's likely when she would have bought it. And it has a very cute navy blue background with a foreground of white and pink flowers with some sprays of green florals. And I just figured this would be super cute for a summer top. They're colors that I like. I love wearing dark blue, and I also like that the pink is more of a salmon cherry colored pink. So my challenge is to take this small scrap of fabric and make a 1950s style top out of it. I started by tracing the pattern pieces for View B onto some scrap tissue paper. I prefer to trace rather than cut out my patterns. I then checked my pattern pieces on my fabric to make sure they'd fit. Thankfully they did fit, with the exception of one of the back pieces, where I had to piece in a scrap of fabric. First, we are going to run 2 parallel lines of gathering stitches on the center fronts and side fronts of the bodice pieces. This is repeated on the lining too. For my lining, I used a lovely smooth cotton sateen. Pin the center fronts together and pull up the gathering threads until the gathering is 3.5 inches long. This is a good place for adjustment if you desire more or less coverage in your top. Pin and gather the center fronts of the lining in the same way. Then stitch the gathered center fronts together, stopping the stitching 5/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge. Press the seam open. Assembling this top is quick and easy. Right sides to right sides, line up the back pieces with the bodice, and adjust the gathers on the side front of the bodice to fit. Repeat on the lining so that it is identical to the bodice. The pattern says to fold the straps in half, sew into a tube, and turn right sides out. I hate the fuss of turning out tubes, so instead I'll press in the seam allowances and stitch the straps from the right side. But, as I can't make anything without deviating from the directions, I'm adding a strip of white cotton sateen into the straps for a subtle contrast. These bias strips were left over from another project. I pressed them in half and basted them to one side of the straps. Then, I folded the other half of the straps to cover the seam allowances. I could have trimmed the seam allowances, but these fabrics are so lightweight that the seam allowances barely added any bulk. I then top stitched along the edges of the strap, securing the bias binding and the 2 sides of the strap together. Next, I'm placing the straps on the back of the bodice per the indications on the pattern. The placement of the straps can be easily adjusted to suit your needs, and I think any of the tops in this pattern can be made with halter straps or crisscross straps. Then I pin the lining to the bodice, right sides together, and stitch them together along the top edge. As usual, clip the seam allowances where there are curved seams, so that when the garment is turned right side out, it can curve over your body. And trim the seam allowances. To keep the lining from peeking through, fold the seam allowances under the lining and stitch through the lining and seam allowances, keeping the stitching very close to the original seam. This is known as understitching. Bring the straps to the front of the bodice and line them up along the side seams. Make sure they will lay flat across your back when worn. The pattern instructs you to just top stitch the straps near the bodice side seam, but I went a step further and stitched down both edges of the straps. You can insert boning into this makeshift channel if you wish. Baste or pin the bottom edges of the bodice and lining together. Lay the two waistband pieces right sides together and stitch them together. Carefully clip into the V shape of the waistband, being careful not to clip the stitching. Press the seam and trim seam allowances, even if the pattern doesn't explicitly tell you to do so. Then press under 5/8 of an inch along one edge of the waistband. Trim this to 1/4 of an inch. We're basically trimming away the seam allowances before sewing the seam. Pin the waistband to the bottom edge of the bodice and stitch them together. Press the seam allowances towards the waistband. Trim the seam allowances. The waistband is then wrapped up to the inside of the bodice to conceal the raw edges, the same way bias binding would do. The instructions tell you to top stitch the band, but I prefer to hand sew it with a whip stitch. This just gives me more control and it looks neater from both sides. Finally, I tried on the bodice to see where I would put the buttons and buttonholes. You'll notice that I placed the buttons horizontally rather than vertically as per the pattern's instructions, but this just looked nicer to me. I'm using 2 vintage buttons from my stash, and I'm sewing them on with the smallest scrap of perfectly matching embroidery thread. The finished bra, bathing suit, top is super cute and comfortable. I should have tried it on before attaching the straps as they turned out a smidge too long, but that's something I can fix later. I love the subtle contrast of the white fabric that I added to the straps. It was also very satisfying to use materials that I already had for this project, even down to the thread. To my utter delight, I realized I had enough of the fabric left over to make myself a coordinating mask. It's the perfect balance of form and function. Thank you, Tyra Banks, for teaching me how to smize 10 years ago. I am so pleased with this pattern. The instructions were concise and descriptive, and the images clearly matched what the instructions were talking about. It's just a super quick, easy garment to throw together, especially if, like me, you have a few scraps of fabric lying around. I think it's a wonderful way to embrace being sustainable and comfortable. We all have scraps lying at the bottom of our fabric bins, but we also want to be comfy as we're lounging around our homes these days. So I'm definitely going to wear this garment when I'm just chilling out, watching Netflix, when I don't feel like wearing a bra. It's super cute, perfect for summertime too. I could definitely see myself wearing this to the beach, to the boardwalk, to walk in Central Park. I do have the tiniest bit of scraps left over, so one day if I make a coordinating skirt, I have these tiny bits of fabric that I can use to make matching buttons so it looks like I have a set. What I also think is great about this pattern is that it's pretty adjustable. So for instance, the version that the model is wearing, view A, you could very easily extend this bottom band to be an entirely separate piece to cover the midriff if you so desire. And I think for a lot of these other pieces too, so view B, which is the one that I made, I could also have just extended that piece downward to make it a top rather than a bra, bikini thing. View C is also very apt to be converted into a full top. If you're feeling handy, you could probably add a ruffle to the halter or change those halter straps to crisscross in the back. It's a pretty blank canvas, and I think that's so fun. I love when patterns just offer an endless variety of garments that you can make from them and a pretty blank slate for customization. Not only is this pattern true to size, it actually doesn't include the enormous amounts of ease that Big 4 patterns tend to include. So my bust measurement, for instance, measured without a bra is 31.5 inches, which corresponds to a size 8, which is the size that I cut out. And then when we look at the finished garment measurements for the bust line, 31.5 inches for size 8. That is chef's kiss. Perfection when the finished garment measurements do not include something crazy like 4 inches of ease. I didn't have to do any serious alterations other than just changing where the buttons were placed on the band. And that's also something I can go back and change later. When my body changes, I can just move around the buttons, I can change the straps. Perfection. Another alteration you could do if you're concerned about support is tightening the band underneath. So since I tightened up my band a little, I find that I'm getting some support from underneath. You could also insert some cups or padding in here. You can hack off an old bra, which is something I might do eventually, and shove it inside if you want a more rounded, supported look. Alternatively, if you want to wear a real bra with this garment, you can measure the back band of your bra and make sure that the back band of any of these tops fits over the band of your bra. And if it doesn't, you can easily extend like the bottom bands that finish off any of these tops to make sure it can fully cover your bra. Perfect. If you know the context in which a garment like this is worn, was it worn at the beach or at the poolside or to lounge around in homes before air conditioning was a thing, please let me know in the comments down below, because I'm curious what the intention of this kind of garment is. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're wondering, yes, I am that psycho who perfectly folds up her patterns.